Nearly 1 million young people are unemployed in the UK. How will the budget change this?
We absolutely need to tackle that, and that's why what was yesterday announced was the youth guarantee, to make sure that we can help with the cost of skilling up young people, get them into work, which will help them and help the economy. But one of the biggest moral issues that we face, I think, as a country is the number of people, young people, who are out of work, and I want to make sure that as many of them.
So the latest unemployment figure has been announced, and the rate has risen to 5% for the 3 months to the end of September. So that's the highest rate since 2021. Average wage growth was 4.6% in the third quarter, and that's ticked down just slightly from the previous period when it was 4.7%.
Something is quietly breaking inside the United Kingdom, and Africa sees it coming before Britain admits it. While officials repeat the same reassurances, jobs are vanishing, not shifting. Entire career paths are dissolving, young workers are stuck, skilled professionals are leaving. And the numbers being celebrated don't reflect real security anymore. Africa recognizes this pattern because it has lived through it.
Britain isn't working. 39 consecutive hikes in unemployment. The IMF today slamming the United Kingdom as having the worst inflation for the next 2 years.
First comes flexible work, then rising living costs, then working poverty, and finally unemployment that no policy can quickly fix. The UK is not facing a temporary slowdown. It is entering a structural jobs crisis, one driven by automation, outsourcing, housing pressure, and shrinking opportunity. And if nothing changes soon, Africa warns that what Britain calls stability today may become crisis tomorrow.
Well, I've calculated that in the last probably 3 months, I've applied for about 400.
I'm Caitlin, I'm a university graduate, and I applied to 647 roles before I got one.
I'm sorry, I've got to stop you there. You cannot possibly say that you're investing more in young people. Labour has made youth employment go down. Unemployment is up.
From Africa's perspective, the warning signs in the United Kingdom are no longer subtle. They are structural, accelerating, and deeply interconnected. While UK officials continue to frame unemployment as cyclical or temporary, African economic observers argue that the crisis is not only real, but worsening in ways Britain is not prepared to confront. The concern is not rooted in rivalry or criticism, but in pattern recognition. Africa has lived through similar transitions before, and it recognizes the signals. The United Kingdom's unemployment problem is no longer about job losses alone. It is about job disappearance. For decades, the UK economy relied heavily on finance, professional services, retail, logistics, hospitality, and public administration. These sectors once provided stable employment across social classes, but automation, digital outsourcing, artificial intelligence, and global competition have steadily eroded their capacity to absorb labor. Roles that once required thousands of workers now require hundreds. Entire layers of middle-income employment have thinned out. Africa sees this clearly because it has experienced the opposite trend. Across many African countries, labor-intensive sectors are expanding, not shrinking. Manufacturing hubs are absorbing young populations. Construction is accelerating. Agriculture is becoming more technologically efficient without eliminating workers. Digital platforms are creating new categories of employment instead of compressing them. The divergence is stark. In the United Kingdom, productivity gains no longer translate into job creation. They translate into cost reduction. Africa notes that this imbalance is compounded by demographic pressure. The UK population is aging rapidly, increasing the burden on a shrinking workforce. At the same time, younger generations face entry-level barriers that didn't exist before. Employers demand experience for roles designed to train. Internships replace jobs. Temporary contracts replace stability. The result is underemployment disguised as participation. From Africa's viewpoint, this is a dangerous illusion. The unemployment crisis is masked by statistics that count part-time, gig, and precarious work as success. But income security is declining, skill utilization is falling, economic confidence is eroding. Africa has seen this pattern before in economies that mistook flexibility for resilience. Another factor Africa highlights is geographic imbalance. In the United Kingdom, economic opportunity is concentrated in a small number of urban centers. Outside these hubs, employment options narrow sharply. Young people migrate internally, hollowing out regions and straining cities. Housing costs rise. Commuting becomes unsustainable. Employers centralize further, reinforcing the cycle. Africa recognizes this trap because it spent decades escaping it. African governments now actively decentralize economic activity, building industrial zones, tech corridors, and logistics hubs across multiple regions simultaneously. This spreads employment, stabilizes housing markets, and reduces migration pressure. The UK, by contrast, continues to funnel opportunity into fewer spaces while expecting the labor market to self-correct. Africa argues that it won't. Technology is another fault line. The UK prides itself on innovation, yet much of that innovation replaces workers rather than empowers them. Artificial intelligence tools, automation platforms, and digital management systems are adopted to reduce payrolls, not expand output. From Africa's perspective, this is a strategic misstep. In many African countries, technology is deployed to scale employment, not shrink it. Digital tools support agriculture, logistics, healthcare, and education in ways that create jobs rather than eliminate them. The UK's approach prioritizes efficiency over inclusion. Africa warns that efficiency without employment creates fragility. Trade dynamics further complicate the situation. The United Kingdom increasingly imports finished goods rather than producing them domestically. Manufacturing capacity has declined steadily, reducing opportunities for skilled and semi-skilled labor. Africa sees this as a critical vulnerability. Many African economies are doing the opposite, building local production, retaining value, and absorbing labor through industrial expansion. The UK's dependence on external supply chains limits its ability to create jobs internally. When global disruptions occur, unemployment rises sharply. Africa understands this risk intimately and has worked to reduce it. The UK has not. Another issue Africa identifies is skills mismatch. UK education systems continue to produce graduates whose skills no longer align with labor market demand. Meanwhile, vocational training, apprenticeships, and technical education lag behind. Africa has learned, often through painful experience, that economies cannot rely solely on academic credentials. Practical skills, adaptability, and local industry alignment matter more. Many African countries now integrate education directly with industrial planning. The UK has yet to fully adopt this model. Public sector strain adds further pressure. The UK relies heavily on government employment to stabilize unemployment figures, but fiscal constraints limit expansion. Budget tightening leads to hiring freezes, contract reductions, and outsourcing. This creates a delayed unemployment effect that Africa recognizes well. When public employment contracts, private sectors rarely compensate quickly enough. Africa sees a lagging crisis, not a resolved one. Perhaps most concerning is confidence. Unemployment is not only an economic statistic, it is a psychological force. Africa observes declining morale among UK workers, especially younger generations, delayed life milestones, housing insecurity, debt accumulation. Africa's concern deepens when examining how the United Kingdom responds to unemployment pressure. From an external viewpoint, the UK is not confronting the root causes of its labor instability. It is managing symptoms. Short-term policy adjustments, temporary incentives, and public messaging aim to calm markets and voters, but they fail to rebuild the foundations of sustainable employment. Africa recognizes this approach because many African economies once relied on it and paid a heavy price. One of the clearest warning signs is the growing gap between employment statistics and lived reality. The UK often reports stable employment levels, yet Africa observes rising household insecurity, increased reliance on food assistance, and expanding debt among working adults. Employment no longer guarantees stability. Africa calls this working poverty, a stage that often precedes a sharper employment collapse when economic shocks arrive. Africa has seen this pattern in economies that assumed job quantity mattered more than job quality. Another structural issue lies in labor flexibility. The UK promotes flexible work as modernization, but Africa notes that flexibility without safeguards shifts risk entirely onto workers. Short-term contracts, zero-hour arrangements, and gig-based roles inflate employment figures while weakening economic resilience. Workers cannot plan, save, or invest in skills when income is unpredictable. Africa warns that this creates a workforce constantly in survival mode, unable to contribute to long-term growth. In contrast, several African countries are prioritizing employment durability. Jobs are tied to infrastructure, manufacturing, logistics, energy, and food systems sectors that absorb labor consistently. Africa understands that stability, not flexibility alone, anchors economies during turbulence. The housing employment trap also worries African analysts. In the UK, high housing costs restrict labor mobility. Workers cannot relocate to where jobs exist because rents consume too much income. This creates artificial unemployment even when positions are available. Africa recognizes this as a silent labor killer. Some African nations now coordinate housing development with industrial planning, ensuring workers can live near economic zones. The UK's separation of housing policy from labour policy, Africa argues, intensifies unemployment pressure rather than relieving it. Migration dynamics further complicate the picture. Africa notes that the UK increasingly depends on migrant labour to fill critical roles while simultaneously tightening pathways for integration. This contradiction creates instability. When labor shortages meet restrictive policies, sectors stall, healthcare, logistics, agriculture, and care services suffer. Africa has learned that labor systems must be aligned with demographic reality, not political convenience. Meanwhile, skilled UK workers are leaving. Africa observes a growing outward flow of British professionals seeking opportunity elsewhere. This is not a sign of curiosity, it is a signal of confidence loss. When educated, mobile workers exit, unemployment pressure worsens at home because innovation slows, businesses hesitate, and investment weakens. Africa recognizes this stage well. It often precedes deeper economic restructuring. Another factor Africa highlights is regional neglect. Large parts of the United Kingdom remain excluded from growth strategies. Industrial decline has not been matched with reinvestment. Promises of regeneration stall. Africa warns that abandoned regions breed long-term unemployment cycles that persist across generations. Several African nations experience this after resource downturns and learned that delay multiplies cost. The UK, Africa fears, is repeating the mistake. Technology adoption remains a double-edged sword. Africa acknowledges that automation is inevitable, but it stresses sequencing. In the UK, automation often arrives before alternative employment pathways are created. Workers are displaced faster than they can retrain. Africa has begun reversing this sequence by pairing automation with job creation in adjacent sectors. Without this balance, Africa argues, unemployment accelerates quietly until it becomes politically explosive. Fiscal pressure adds another layer of risk. The UK's ability to stimulate employment through public spending is constrained. Debt servicing, aging populations, and healthcare demands reduce fiscal flexibility. Africa notes that when governments lose spending capacity during labor transitions, unemployment becomes structural rather than cyclical. The UK appears increasingly boxed in. Perhaps most troubling to African observers is the erosion of trust. Unemployment crises deepen when citizens stop believing systems will protect them. Africa sees growing skepticism among UK workers about retraining promises, job guarantees, and long-term security. Once trust breaks, labor participation declines. People disengage, not because they are unwilling to work, but because they no longer believe work will lead to stability. Africa has lived through that phase and knows how hard it is to reverse. Education systems also contribute to the worsening outlook. The UK continues to emphasize credentials over adaptability. Africa notes that modern labor markets reward skills that evolve rapidly. Several African countries now redesign education around modular training, continuous reskilling, and direct industry alignment. The UK's slower adaptation risks producing graduates ill-equipped for available jobs, fueling underemployment and frustration. Global competition compounds these issues. Africa observes that the UK increasingly competes with faster-growing regions for investment. Capital flows toward markets with scalable labor, expanding consumer bases, and growth narratives. Africa now fits that profile. The UK, facing stagnation, must work harder to attract the same capital. When investment slows, job creation follows. From Africa's perspective, the unemployment crisis is worsening not because the UK lacks resources, but because its systems resist transformation. Africa learned often painfully that denial delays recovery. Structural shifts require uncomfortable reform, not surface adjustments. Africa's warning is not one of prediction, but recognition. The UK stands at a familiar crossroads. One path leads to adaptation, reinvention, and renewed employment growth. The other leads to managed decline, where unemployment becomes normalized rather than solved. Africa has walked both paths in different eras. That is why Africa says the UK's unemployment crisis is only getting worse, not as an accusation, but as a caution drawn from experience.